January 14, 1943, on a narrow goat path, 3,000 feet above the French-Spanish border. Andrée de Jongh was 26 years old, soaked through to the bone, and responsible for the lives of 4 men who could barely walk. 3 were Allied airmen shot down over Belgium weeks earlier. 1 was a British intelligence officer carrying sensitive documents. The Pyrenees in winter were murderous, even in daylight. At night, in freezing rain, with German patrols sweeping the valleys below, they were a death sentence for anyone without absolute certainty of the route. Dédé, the name the network used for her, had made this crossing more than a dozen times. She knew every switchback, every false summit, every place where the rock turned to ice, and men simply vanished into the gorge. Behind her, the officer stumbled. She caught his arm without breaking stride. They had 6 more hours to the Spanish side. If they were still on French soil at dawn, the Gestapo would find them, and the entire Comet Line, the network she had built from nothing, the operation that had already delivered over 100 airmen back to England, would unravel in a matter of days. She did not know, as she steadied the officer and pressed on through the storm, that historians would later argue over whether a woman that young could truly have been the architect of such an operation. She did not know that even after her arrest, German interrogators would dismiss her confession, insisting the real leader must be a man. She only knew that if she stopped moving, they would all die. This is the story of the woman who designed, financed, and personally commanded one of the most successful escape lines in occupied Europe, and who survived the war in part because her enemies could not imagine her. Andrée de Jongh was not raised to defy empires. She was born in 1916 in Schaerbeek, a working-class district of Brussels, to a schoolteacher father and a mother who believed in quiet dignity and hard work. Her father, Frédéric, was a veteran of the First World War who had seen what violence did to men and refused to glorify it. He taught Andrée to think clearly, to question authority, and to recognize injustice when she saw it. By the time she was 18, she was working as a commercial artist, sketching advertisements for soap and biscuits, and volunteering as a nurse in her spare time. She was small, soft-spoken, and easy to overlook. People often mistook her for a teenager. That anonymity would become her greatest weapon. When the Germans invaded Belgium in May 1940, Andrée was 23. She watched the Wehrmacht roll through Brussels, watched collaborators pin on new badges, watched neighbors inform on neighbors. The occupation was efficient and thorough. Resistance seemed impossible. Most people kept their heads down. Andrée did not. She began volunteering at a hospital that treated wounded Allied soldiers left behind in the chaos of Dunkirk. Many of them were in hiding, trying to avoid capture and deportation to prisoner of war camps. The Belgian government in exile had collapsed. There was no organized network to help them. Andrée decided to create one. In the summer of 1941, she approached her father with a plan. She would guide the first group of stranded soldiers from Brussels to the south of France, then over the Pyrenees into Spain. From there, British consulates could arrange their return to England. It was insane. She had no money, no contacts in the French resistance, no training in clandestine work. She spoke fluent French, but her English was limited. She had never climbed a mountain. Frédéric did not try to stop her. He simply asked how he could help. By August, they had recruited a small circle of friends, an elementary school teacher, a widow who ran a safe house, a Belgian businessman with connections in Paris. Andrée gave the network a name, Comet, the Comet Line. She would later say she chose it because comets moved fast and burned bright. The first escape attempt almost ended in disaster. Andrée and a friend escorted 3 British soldiers to the French border, only to discover that the contact they had arranged in Lille had been arrested the day before. They had no backup plan. Andrée found a farmer willing to hide the men for a night, then walked 60 kilometers to the next town to find another contact. She was gone for 2 days. When she returned, the soldiers were still there, terrified but alive. She got them to Paris, then to the Pyrenees, then across the Spanish border. The entire journey took 3 weeks. When the men finally reached the British consulate in Barcelona, they could not believe the person who had saved them was a young Belgian woman who looked like she should still be in school. That reaction followed her everywhere. In Paris, where she began coordinating with French resistance cells, older men repeatedly assumed she was someone's daughter or girlfriend. In Spain, British intelligence officers interviewed her with visible skepticism, asking if she was truly the one making decisions or simply relaying messages from someone else. Even the airmen she rescued sometimes treated her as a helpful assistant rather than the architect of their escape. Andrée found the condescension maddening and useful. If men underestimated her, so would the Gestapo. She began to lean into the perception. She dressed plainly. She smiled often. She let people assume she was naive. When she met with contacts in cafes or train stations, she made herself as forgettable as possible. The Gestapo was hunting for saboteurs, for armed resistors, for men with military training. They were not looking for a quiet girl with paint under her nails. By the spring of 1942, the Comet Line was operating at full capacity. Andrée had built a chain of safe houses stretching from Brussels to the Pyrenees, each one maintained by ordinary people, shopkeepers, farmers, nuns who risked execution every day. She had established contacts with Spanish border guides who knew the mountain paths. She had secured funding from the British intelligence service, which funneled money through coded messages and dead drops. And she had developed a system of strict operational security. No real names, no written records, no unnecessary risks. Each guide along the route knew only their own section. If one link broke, the rest of the chain could survive. She personally escorted dozens of airmen. Most of them were young, barely out of training, and psychologically shattered by being shot down and hunted. She coached them on how to walk like civilians, how to avoid eye contact with German patrols, how to stay calm during identity checks. On the train south, she sat with them and pretended to be their sister or cousin, chatting in broken English while German soldiers passed through the cars. She carried a small brass compass in her coat pocket, a gift from her father, engraved with her initials. She never used it for navigation. It was a talisman, a reminder of the one person who believed in her from the beginning. The Pyrenees crossing was the most dangerous part of the journey. The mountains killed more escapees than the Gestapo did. Andrée made the trip herself whenever possible, partly because experienced guides were scarce, partly because she refused to ask others to take risks she would not take. She learned to read the weather, to pace the group so no one collapsed from exhaustion, to keep moving even when her own legs were numb. The airmen she guided were often bigger and stronger than she was, but they were not trained for endurance. She was. One pilot later recalled watching her climb a near-vertical rock face in the dark, in freezing rain, without hesitation while he could barely force himself to follow. When they reached Spain, he asked how old she was. She told him he did not believe her. That hesitation, the small moment of doubt when she spoke her plan aloud, would later be reported to London as evidence that someone else must be giving her orders. The Gestapo began closing in. In late 1942, several safe houses were raided. Key contacts were arrested. The network lost 2 experienced guides in the span of a month. Andrée knew the Germans were getting closer. She changed routes, rotated safe houses, and moved her base of operations from Brussels to Paris. She kept working. By the time she was arrested in January 1943, the Comet Line had delivered over 100 Allied airmen back to England. British intelligence estimated that those men, returned to active duty, represented the equivalent of an entire bomber squadron. Andrée did not think in those terms. She thought about faces. Each airman had a name, a family, a reason to survive. That was enough. In January 1943, she was betrayed. A Belgian collaborator infiltrated the network and passed her description to the Gestapo. On January 15, one day after her successful Pyrenees crossing, she was arrested in a farmhouse near Bayonne. The Gestapo had been expecting a man, possibly a former military officer, possibly someone with intelligence training. When they found Andrée, they assumed she was the girlfriend of the real organizer. They interrogated her for hours, demanding to know where her superior was. She told them the truth. There was no superior. She had created the network. She ran it. She made the decisions. They dismissed her confession, convinced she was protecting someone else. One interrogator laughed, Andrée de Jongh. Another insisted she was shielding her boyfriend or her father. They showed her photographs of men they suspected and asked her to identify the leader. She repeated, calmly, that she was the leader. They sent her to Ravensbrück. The Gestapo's refusal to accept her story saved her life. If they had believed she was the chief organizer of the Comet Line, they would have executed her immediately. Instead, they classified her as a minor operative, dangerous enough to imprison, but not important enough to kill. She spent the next 2 years in the concentration camp, surviving typhus, forced labor, and constant hunger. The small brass compass was confiscated during intake. She never saw it again. In the camp, she did not speak about what she had done. She kept her head down. She helped others when she could. She waited. The Comet Line did not collapse after her arrest. Her father and the other organizers continued the operation, adapting to new risks and new betrayals. By the end of the war, the network she had built would rescue over 700 Allied airmen. Andrée's contribution represented the foundation, the initial design, the proven routes, the operational structure that made everything else possible. Without her work in those first critical years, there would have been no network to continue. She was liberated in April 1945, weighing 78 pounds. She returned to Brussels and found that most of the city had moved on. The war was over. People wanted to forget. Andrée returned to a life of service, first as a nurse in Brussels, later in places most people never saw. She did not speak publicly about the Comet Line for years. When journalists eventually tracked her down, they often framed her story as an anomaly, a charming exception to the rule that resistance work was men's work. She found that framing insulting but unsurprising. It took decades for historians to fully document the scale of what she had accomplished. The medals and honors came late, too late for her father, who died before receiving official recognition. Andrée attended the ceremonies quietly, without bitterness. She had done what needed to be done. That was all. In her later years, she worked as a nurse in leper colonies in Africa. The same quiet competence that had built an escape network now applied to treating the sick in places no one else wanted to go. She did not see the work as heroic. She saw it as necessary. When asked, late in life, whether she had ever been afraid during the war, she said yes, constantly. Fear was not the absence of courage, it was the cost of it. Andrée de Jongh died in 2007 at the age of 90. Her obituaries called her a hero of the Belgian resistance, a savior of Allied airmen, a woman of remarkable courage. All of that was true, but the deeper truth was simpler and stranger. She survived, in part because the men hunting her could not imagine that someone like her could be dangerous. Their contempt became her camouflage. And in the end, that invisibility, the same invisibility that denied her recognition for so long, was the thing that kept her alive long enough to matter. How many wars are won by people whose names we never learn?